I am going to talk about nature journaling questions. And this is something that is so important. And we talk about it a lot in the nature journaling community. But right now, I'm going to go into depth and categorize questions towards a taxonomy of questions, because knowing what types of questions you can ask and how those different types relate to each other is going to help you when you're nature journaling in the field and you need to come up with more and better questions, because sometimes we take questioning for granted. This is based on and especially directed towards the people who took my class for International Nature Journaling Week, which just happened last week in June of 2021. So this is a taxonomy of questions. I'm going to categorize a bunch of questions into some of these types that I have spent a lot of time working on and developing. And hopefully these tools will help you when you're nature journaling in the field to see more deeply, ask more insightful questions, and think about questions in a new way. If you come up with ideas of how to add to this taxonomy, definitely let me know and post something in the comments below. Without further ado, I'm going to switch to my document camera and draw out this taxonomy of questions for nature journaling and for life, but specifically for nature journaling. So let me just switch to my document camera here. All right. So first, and this is a type of question that people automatically ask very frequently, are who questions. So I'm going to call these agent questions. And this is a natural human question to ask. You can see this cross-culturally, and this is very insightful into how we see the world and understand the world. An agent is an actor, something that is making decisions. And when we can figure out the answer to this question, sometimes it gives us hints and helps us predict. And that is the way that our brain works. So when you find a feather or an animal track, or you see a bird flying, you often will notice that the first questions that people ask are going to be who questions. Who left that animal poop? Who left that track? Whose feather is that? What kind of bird is that? And a lot of nature connection teachers sometimes will avoid answering this question right away. And there are some benefits to avoiding this question, but there is a reason why this question comes first. And that's because this question can often give us insights or help us make predictions about agency and causation. And that helps you make predictions. And that is something that is really important for people. And especially for like our ancestors, early humans. So this also leads to motivation questions about purpose, and is somewhat related to questions about meaning and story. This connects in turn to why questions. So after you ask a who question, such as, who is that bird, or who did that feather come from? What species did that come from? What animal left that track? A lot of times people will ask why questions. Why did it do that? Why is it going this way? Why did the chicken cross the road? So this is also in turn connected to agency and causation, motivation and purpose, because we're trying to get into the head of the animal that we're asking questions about. Or why did that thing happen in nature? Why is the sky blue? So these are really common questions. And the reason why humans are really interested in them is because, in my opinion, we're trying to figure out patterns and make predictions. So similar to the importance of the who questions, the why question can help humans figure out patterns. In nature journaling, these come up a lot. However, they can be problematic, and they also can have assumptions built into them. And that's something that I talked about in my class about asking questions. So you have to watch out for the assumptions that could be built into these. And your patterns, we're just as likely to see patterns that are not really in the real world, that are just in our mind. We have what's called pattern hunger. And even sometimes when there's not a correlation or a causal relationship, we will attribute a pattern to them. Okay, so that's sort of one major sort of lineage taxonomy of questions. Now, the next one where this sort of leads to is what I call relationship questions. So these are where it starts to get interesting, and I think these are also ones that people forget to ask. The types of questions in these two categories it's very likely you're already asking questions in these categories. So next, relationship questions. These can provide prompts for you when you're trying to come up with better questions in your nature journaling, to know these different categories. So relationship questions. How are these things related? How are these things related? And one of the main things that we often ask is this thing, what does this thing eat? Or what things eat it? Is there a genetic relationship? So when we ask species questions, or we ask like, what family is this in? We're asking, is there a genetic relationship? Is there a social relationship? We might ask a question, is that bird related to that other bird that it's moving around with? Are they partners? Are they mates? Are they relatives? Community questions. Are these plants or animals part of a community? Ecological relationships. Ecology is basically the study of relationships. Then this leads to a really important one, which I call the ethical questions or the empathy questions. It's easy to forget these when we're looking at nature. I mean, the ethical ones I think are built in somehow to the way we work as human animals. But we sometimes, when we're looking at nature from a Western perspective, we separate ourselves from nature and forget that we are also in relationship with nature. So these ethical or empathy questions are something that our ancestors for sure would have asked a lot, in terms of relationships, such as, can I eat this plant or animal? So can I eat it? That's a very basic one. And if you look at children, for example, like babies, they go through the world asking this question a lot. They try eating everything or putting things in their mouth. So other questions are like, what is my role? So when we're nature journaling, sometimes we just look at things and describe the things that we see in nature, but what is my role? What is my connection to what I'm seeing? And in this day and age, you're actually surprisingly connected to things that are happening on the complete other side of the planet. So asking this question, what is your responsibility? How do your daily choices affect that aspect of nature, if at all? Responsibility. So this is a category that I think often is forgotten in our nature journaling, but is useful to ask. And this can lead to, some really interesting questions. So somewhat related to that, on a similar end, actually, I'm going to go back to some of the more basic questions here again. And these are some that you probably are already doing. And you might be doing them in a less of a curiosity-based way and less of sort of a question-asking way. But let's go to describing and quantifying. So how big is it? How many feathers does it have? How much does it weigh? These are things we sometimes, before we ask the question, we just skip straight to the description or the quantification. And this is where drawing falls into this category. So I'm going to write describe. These are sort of engineer questions. They're the basic questions. How big is something? How much does it weigh? They're kind of boring, but they can also be the beginning of your inquiry. And so when you draw something or measure something, it would fit into this category. How big? How many toes? What kind of feathers? And a lot of these are the type of questions that you can answer in the field or you can look them up. And a lot of times it is useful to actually answer these questions. Some of the types of questions, they're not necessarily about being answered. So this can often lead you to why questions. So for example, if you ask a question about the type of feathers, you get the answer, and then you ask, why does it have red feathers on that part of its tail? And remember, why questions don't always have an answer. It's really easy for us to, because we're meaning making animals and storytelling animals, it's really easy for us to go to nature and assume that there is a reason for everything, a why reason, but there isn't always. So this could lead you to there. And describe and quantify can also lead you to the process and function questions. So process and function are basically how questions. How, process, function. So these are the next stage of sort of engineering questions. How does it work? I should put like a gear, something that looks like a gear. Even though we're talking about things in nature, gear, I think, is a good symbol for function. So how does it work? So if I just described or tried to quantify the branches of a tree, I might ask, how does that leaf shape help it photosynthesize? How does that leaf shape help it retain moisture? Does that leaf shape help it retain moisture? Or if I'm looking at an animal's skull that I find and it has teeth, how do those teeth work? What do those teeth do? So that would be your process function question. These are great. These are sort of a great place to start after you describe and quantify. So it's pretty easy. A lot of people are probably already asking these. Somewhat related to these would be like your spatial questions and your time questions. So time, especially if you're doing like animal tracking, time is a really useful question. There's a lot of ones related to this. How old is it? How old is that feather? How long does that animal live for? How long ago did that feather fall off of the animal? How long does it take that animal to grow a feather? How fast does that animal move? That is related to time as well. So there's a whole bunch of time questions. When did that happen? When is the obvious? I should have put that in green as well. When is the sort of question word that you might have learned for these type of questions, but they don't always start with when. Sometimes they are how long did it take to grow? How long will it take to decompose? How long will it live for? How long will it reproduce for? How long will it take? When will we get there? Those are all time-related questions. So pretty basic in your sort of general questions in describing and quantifying something, and these often are quantifiable. You can answer some of these questions in the field on your own, which is really cool. So the answerability on a lot of these ones is pretty direct, directly observable. Why questions often are not answerable by science, so that's an important thing to know. Okay, and then next, sort of related to time, is spatial. So these are your where questions. These are also describable oftentimes, and they're connected to relationships too. So you can use a map to show this in your nature journal and to ask these questions, even visually asking questions, which is something I think we need to work on more. And they're also contextual. So this is giving you information besides just that organism. So you might be doing a species profile of a plant. And instead of just drawing the plant, you could show a little map of where in the world it exists. So this one comes from the west coast of South America, based on my quick sketch there. So context, where in the world, what else is around it in that area? Where is it on a mountain? Is it high? Is it low? Is it near water? So these are all really interesting contextual questions about space. So space, time, process, function, describing and quantifying. These are some of your basic questions that you're going to be asking that are very descriptive. And a lot of these, if you go back to the reason why people often ask these who and why questions first, some of these are nested inside of these questions. So if you can answer the who question, and this is why people often obsess with this part, and our brain goes in this direction. If you can answer the who question, you often can have a lot of guesses, a lot of information about all of these questions built into that one. So the way that our brain works and the way that we've survived as a species is being able to jump to conclusions and recognize patterns very quickly. And by asking who questions and why questions, we often avoid a bunch of these questions because these are built into those ones. If you're a little kid or you're a baby, you might be asking tons of these questions until you start developing a system of cataloging that information underneath who categories. And so then you only need to know who something is. And once you know something is a bird, then your brain fills in a bunch of other information. With nature journaling, we don't want to assume too much. So it's good to even practice some of these questions when you think you know the answer based on who something is that you're describing. Okay, so another one that's sort of related to these sort of engineering questions is what I call the ingredients question. So this is sort of more on the like chemistry end, and I think of it as ingredients. It could be sort of a what question. So ingredients. What went into this thing? What is this thing made up of? So what is its composition? composition, chemicals. Is it edible? Leads back to this one. Is it poisonous? Even questions like why is the sky blue might be related to this, or why is the feather red could go back to this question. What's inside? What's the smell? What's the taste? Those are all ingredient questions, chemistry questions. What is the fur made up of? Okay, now I'm going to start getting into these ones that are a little bit more what I would call meta. So these are ones that are really important. Many of them might not be answerable, but they're very important for your thinking. So I'm just going to write, some of these are meta too, like ethical and empathy can be meta, but this category over here is going to be pretty much all meta. So first is question the questions. And I talked about this a lot in the 10 journaling techniques for asking questions, specific techniques for using questions, which I'll summarize at the end of this. But hopefully you saw that during International Nature Journaling Week when I did a whole class about question asking. So questioning the questions. Sometimes we have, or frequently we have questions that have assumptions built into them. So question the assumption. Well, first I'll just write question the question. That is the category. So question the assumption. So right now I'll give you a couple examples. I'll give you a little exercise. So now you can stop taking notes because I'm going to give you a pop quiz. Are you ready for the pop quiz? I hope you are ready for the pop quiz because right now I'm going to read you a bunch of questions that I asked in my nature journal, and you're going to have to see what the assumptions are that are built into those questions. So that means that if there's an assumption built into a question, that means that not only am I sort of starting with, I'm starting with a false beginning because the assumption might be false, it might be true, but it's also limiting what possible answers I could get. And that is extremely problematic. It's also problematic because it can be a sneaky way to trick people into making that assumption with you. So for example, this is sometimes used in political campaigns when people do, they do these pretend census where they call you and they ask you questions, but built into their questions is actually these assumptions about which of the candidates is better or not. So here's an example question. Why are those two lizards fighting? Why are those two lizards fighting? So go ahead and pause the video after I give this list of questions and see if you can come up with the assumptions that are built into each one. So question number 1, why are these two lizards fighting? Question number 2, what pollinators pollinate that flower? Question number 3, how do spines protect that plant? Question number 4, what relationships does that rock have to the local geology? Question number 5, why is that bird making noise at me? Question number 6, why is that bird showing off? Question number 7, why is that bird collecting plants for a nest? Question number 8, what purpose or role do the stripes on that animal have? So pause the video right now and see if you can find the assumption in each one of those questions. All right, I hope you scored pretty well, but if you couldn't find assumption in some of those questions, that's fine. This is something that we need to practice more, and we can start doing that through nature journaling. Nature journaling with other people can be a really helpful way to notice your assumptions. It's easier to notice someone else's assumptions than to notice your own assumptions inside of your own head. So I'm going to go back to question number 3 as an example. How do spines protect that plant? The assumption is that spines protect that plant. So many of us go around the world with the assumption that cactus have spines to protect them from herbivores, and that other plants also have spines to protect them from herbivores. And that may be the case sometimes, but if we ask this question, we're assuming that that is the case. And as it turns out, spines can have other functions as well. And it's also possible for there to be things in nature that do not have a function at all. I know that is a challenging concept to think about, but things in nature do not always have a function or a purpose. So remember that when you're nature journaling, because I know for me, one of my favorite things to do in my nature journal with my questioning and my curiosity is to try to find out explanations for why structures in nature exist and what their function is. However, things don't work into a perfect story in nature, and that question is not always answerable and can also be misleading. So that is an example of questioning your assumptions. I hope you did well on that little quiz and didn't get too stressed out. Now, questioning the assumptions is an example of meta questions. Meta just means above or over in Greek. And the next one is questioning the context. Sometimes the context that we're observing nature in might be misleading. So just being aware of what else is going around. The next one, and this is related, is to questioning the context, is perspective. So perspective is really important and can really influence your answers. So it's important to be aware of this, such as asking questions such as, can I look at this differently? I will show you a visual way that we can do this. So we often can do this with our drawings because we automatically experiment with looking at things from different perspectives. So let me find an example here. Here's an example with a fish where I tried to look at the gills from underneath the side of the head and to draw it from that perspective, which I usually don't draw fish from that perspective. So in our drawings, changing perspective can be really helpful in nature journaling because what we see a lot of times is just based on the perspective that we're using. And when we take a different perspective, we might see things that are totally different. So can I look at this differently is one example. So another example of this question is, I went and nature journaled in the tide pools at night, and the tide pools at night look totally different than they do during the day. It would be really easy to have a bunch of questions and assumptions about the tide pools based on only looking at them during the day, but if I look at them at night, I can see a bunch of stuff that I was blind to before. So, for example, I could ask, what would this look like at night? Another example is, how would a kid see this? Or this is sort of, I think I used this in the ingredients question, but what does this look like on the inside? In botany, this is very important. We often try to look at flowers from different perspectives and cut up the flowers to look at them on the inside. This is something that Leonardo da Vinci did. He changed his perspective a lot and looked at things from different ways and asked questions about perspective. Another example would be, how would a mountain lion see this? How would my dog, I don't have a dog, by the way, but how would my dog see this? How would someone who has a very different belief system from you see this? Those are all perspective questions, super important, and this applies to other aspects of life besides nature journaling, but this can really help you in your nature journaling, in your question asking. So there's some more metacognitive questions that I'm going to put up here. Starting with epistemology, one of my favorites. Epistemology is the philosophical branch that deals with knowledge. How do we know what we know? So this is really important when you're nature journaling and you're bringing in outside information that you haven't observed directly. That's one example. So for example, how do I know about robins? So this is super important with things that we take for granted. So plants and animals, or like the cactus question. How do I know that spines protect cactus? How do I know what is a cactus? What is the definition of a cactus? Did that knowledge come from a book? Did it come from something someone told me? Is it something I observed directly? So how do I know? How do I know what I know? And if someone else tells you, just because I told you that not all cactus spines are for protecting from herbivores, just because I told you that doesn't necessarily mean it's true, but it's also important to recognize that a lot of times we think things are true just because someone in a teacher role told us that, or someone who is supposedly an expert told us that. So how do you know what you know is epistemology? Where did that knowledge come from? Where did info come from? I'm running out of space. All right. So then here are some other questions that are metacognitive. What am I missing? So this is a powerful one that can stimulate thought, and our brain is not really good at this. Our brain likes to give us the sense that we have the complete picture, but asking this question, say you're nature journaling this monitor lizard, like I was recently. At the end of this session, I'm doing this from a video, so I'm not doing it in the field. I could just ask at the end, and this could just be a way to kind of open my mind a little bit and maybe build some mental flexibility. And for myself, I could just ask, what questions am I not asking? What am I missing? What am I assuming? What perspective did I not take? What questions did I not ask? What should I have noticed? Those are all metacognitive questions, and those are super powerful. Some of the most powerful thinkers in history ask these kinds of questions. It takes a lot of humility to be able to ask these questions, and this is really where discovery can come from. What am I missing? What is my pattern? Here's another one that can be sort of a metacognitive one that's behavioral too. What is my pattern? Like, what is your nature journaling pattern? Do you always do the same thing? Are there certain things that you're afraid of doing? What is my pattern in my nature journaling? At what point do I stop asking questions in my nature journaling? Why do I never use numbers in my nature journaling? Do numbers actually line up with my intentions for nature journaling? But for some reason, I have a math phobia left over from high school. And so I came up with a story that numbers aren't fun. What is my pattern? What motivates me more? What demotivates me from nature journaling? What do I worry about? What helps me nature journal more? These are the kinds of questions that can really unlock your potential in nature journaling. So I recommend watching like my other video, Unlock Your Potential. I think it's called. If you search for that on my YouTube channel, you'll find it. And I talk about these kind of questions and how working through these questions can make you such a better nature journaler. Another one here would be, how am I doing? Just checking in with yourself partway through a nature journaling session, providing feedback for yourself. And the amazing thing is that a journal is the most powerful tool for processing these kinds of questions. When you get them on paper, it helps you develop this metacognitive ability. It helps you sort of get a little bit outside of it. So for example, right here, I wrote tricky to capture yet characteristic facial profile. I was really disappointed with the way this drawing came out. It did not look like the face of the animal I was trying to draw. So what I did is, instead of just letting those feelings get stuck inside my head, I wrote this down here. And just by getting it out on paper, that helps me move beyond it. This one didn't come out very good. The proportions or something about it doesn't have the right feeling of the way this monitor lizard, the way its face and head should look. So I drew a frowny face, and I vented. I used a little bit of venting here, and getting that out on paper instead of keeping it inside of your head will really help. And doing these kinds of things in your nature journal can really help you unlock some things that might be holding you back. Then the last type of question that I'm going to mention, and I think this one will help everybody, is synthesis questions. This is one of my favorite words. So this is going to help you with your memory. If you struggle with memory, this is going to help you. And really, in a lot of ways, intelligence can be described as the ability to make connections between disparate things. That can be a definition of intelligence and also a definition of creativity. So when you nature journal, you can ask questions that tie it back. These are some trailing sentences you can use. How does this relate? Relate to ... How does this relate to me? How does this relate to the wildflowers I drew last month? How does this relate to the deer that I saw on my drive over here? How does this relate to my house cat? How does this relate to the climate changes where I live? How does this relate to the birds that are nesting on the side of my house? So all of those kinds of questions. Another, how does this relate to something that I learned in a book recently? Those are good examples of synthesis questions. This could be another trailing sentence. What connection does this have? Or what connection might this have? From sort of an artistic perspective, I shouldn't give this secret away, but you might ask questions such as, how might we combine this with other techniques? So for example, I sometimes, and this is a secret I shouldn't be giving away, but I sometimes study different types of art and think about how might I combine the way that this Russian fairy tale illustrator does sky holes, how might I combine that with my own landscape approaches and practice his style of doing sky holes in trees and apply that to my nature journaling. So this is a synthesis question because you're synthesizing nature journaling with illustration or whatever, but how might this apply to my nature journaling? If you look at a sign at a park, how might this apply? And this is going to make it so that you observe more and learn that particular thing better, but then it's also going to help you exponentially more if you are able to actually combine this with something else that you already know. So you'll first of all pay more attention in the moment, notice more in the moment, but also potentially come up with novel new connections. So how might this apply to my nature journaling? If you're nature journaling and you're learning something, how might this apply to my personal life? If at all, it might not apply. I'm going to say home life, or my relationships, or my work, my career. So these are just examples of questions you can ask that synthesize. So they're basically connecting circles and triangles. Whoops, that's a weird triangle. Connecting them and combining them into something new and different. And this is one of the most powerful things that you can do with your mind and your nature journal. Nature journaling is already a synthesis of nature and journaling. It's a synthesis of words, numbers, drawings, art, science, natural history, fun, chocolate, watercolor, outdoors, not always outdoors, community, learning. So there's a lot of synthesis already happening in nature journaling, and that is one of the things that I love about it. And so I really hope that this class can help you, because I think this is something that might feel a little bit challenging for some people. We might take it for granted. Oh, I already know how to ask questions. I don't need a taxonomy of questions. It might feel a little nerdy, a little bit cerebral, going this in depth for 45 minutes talking about a taxonomy of questions. But I really think this is the kind of thing, this is where we're pushing the edge in nature journaling. This is how we can make nature journaling grow faster. We can all learn so much better, asking better questions, not just quantitatively more questions in our nature journal, but thinking about what are those types of questions and building a vocabulary as a nature journaling movement. What are some of those ideas that you've had, that you have new ideas for? How can we keep building this movement, thinking of different types of questions? So if you have anything to add, if you can think of some other major categories that I should include on here for types of questions, let me know. John Muir Laws has done a lot of great work on how to ask questions in your nature journal. Fiona does a lot of question asking, and I think she's done videos with John Muir Laws about question asking. There's a lot of people working on this. So let's see what we can do together, how we can learn so much more together, how we can synthesize some of these ideas, and getting a taxonomy of questions, moving in the direction of having some sort of system and taxonomy and thinking about these categories means that when you're out there nature journaling in the field, it'll be easier for you to ask good questions and connect with those different parts of your brain, activate those different parts of your brain, and really unlock your potential, unlock your curiosity, unlock your mental growth, improve your memory, and all of these things through better question asking. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you can't wait all the way until next week for the next episode of the show, just check out all of the other shows that I'm doing below. I have a bunch of great questions, and there's a whole playlist about asking better questions for nature journaling. All right, I hope you enjoyed this episode. Bye.